We've been talking quite a bit about the stress response and the ways in which our body automatically responds when we are faced with a perceived stressor. So, there are three main body systems that respond to stress within humans. The first and a very important one is the brain. It all starts with the brain. And essentially, when we're faced with a stressor, the thinking parts of our brain may go offline for a little bit, and the amygdala kicks into action. Okay? And if you click on the link or copy and paste the link after the word immune on the slide, it gives you a little bit more information about exactly what the brain is doing. It has a great picture of the brain and points out the different centers of the brain that kick into action in order to help our bodies respond appropriately to a stressor. Okay? Essentially, the limbic system is the primary brain area that deals with stress. So when you experience a stressor, the limbic system immediately responds by sending a message to our nervous system, to our endocrine system. And the endocrine system is in charge of glands and hormones. So once the endocrine system is kicked into gear, important hormones are released, such as adrenaline, that start a metabolic response, which allows us to cope with the threat or the danger that we're facing when we experience a stressor. And as I mentioned earlier, in this day and age, the threats that our body may think that we are about to experience or that our body prepares for is very different than the threats of our ancient ancestors. And sometimes this stress response gets activated, that adrenaline is pumping through our body, and we may not need it quite in the same way to deal with the perceived stressor that is ahead of us. So, once those hormones, those important hormones, start to go through our body, we're going to notice certain physiological changes. So, for example, our heart will start to beat faster, our blood pressure goes up, the rate of our pulse will also increase. Going to begin to breathe more quickly. Our lungs are going to be able to take in more oxygen with each breath. Extra oxygen is going to be sent to our brain, so our alertness will be increased. Some of our other senses will sharpen, such as our hearing and our sight. And sugars are released into our body um, so that we could have some temporary storage of fat in case that's what is needed. So it's amazing how the body responds, and it really does prepare us to effectively handle whatever that threat, whatever that stressor is, so that we could survive. Now, the immune system is important because this system is connected in that it can be weakened after repeated activation of this stress response. So I'm taking us back to the picture we saw a little earlier. So over time, if this stress response is activated far too often or it remains activated because of repeated exposure to a chronic stressor, these are the body systems that can be impacted. So now we move to talk about stress in our bodies. I am not going to read through all of the symptoms, but you can take a moment to pause the presentation and read through all of them. But we have emotional symptoms in response to prolonged exposure to stress. This could include feeling overwhelmed and moody, becoming apathetic, and depression and anger. There are behavioral systems or symptoms that we might experience when we have repeated exposures to stressors or exposure to chronic stress. And this could include losing our temper, eating more or less. Sometimes people self medicate and they have increased use of drugs or alcohol, losing our tempers, sleeping too much or too less. There are also intellectual symptoms. And again, you can pause the presentation and read through all of them. But those intellectual symptoms can include feeling confused, problems with our memory, poor judgment, feeling like you just want to run away or escape. And then there are also physical symptoms. And in that picture that you saw of the human body a little earlier, it had a number of those listed as it relates to important systems within our body. But these physical symptoms can include chest pain, skin problems, decreased sex drive, fatigue, as well as problems with our sleep. So, although responses to stress are critical to our survival, they are there to protect us. It can be dangerous if we allow it to. Part of this is about our mindset and what we do to positively cope with the stressors in our lives. There are some illnesses that are impacted by stress, and below are just some illnesses that have been linked to stress. In the sense that exposure to chronic stress and to prolonged stress can impact how how this disease affects you. This could include infertility, diabetes, high blood pressure, um, our memory, ulcers, and you can pause and read some of the other ailments. So now we're going to talk about stress and work. For many Americans, our jobs are an important part of who we are. It's a way that we're able to take care of ourselves and our families and provide the things that we need. Nonetheless, that same job can come with a certain amount of stress, and there could be some burnout too that happens at work. Job stress refers to harmful emotional and physical responses that happen when job requirements do not match the resources, capabilities, or the needs of the worker, and this could lead to injury or poor health. Causes of job stress are both related to the individual person and their personality and their ability to cope, as well as to the working conditions. Um, and sometimes working conditions might not be the best conditions if there are conflicting expectations or if there's an excessive workload, or perhaps it's an unsafe environment and maybe all the equipment that you need isn't provided or it might be outdated. Additional work conditions that could lead to stress are when there's a lack of support from your supervisors, there's job insecurity, you're not sure whether you'll have your job from one day to the next, when there's poor communication and lack of organization, and the workload is just way too heavy. There are some early warning signs of job stress, and you could think about your own job and whether you're feeling stressed because of the working conditions at your job, and then also think about yourself as an individual and be honest with yourself about your mindset and about your ability to cope and your resources. Um, and as part of the readings for this week, one of the workbook exercises relates to our jobs and being able to understand stress at our jobs a little bit better. So, if you're feeling a little bit stressed about work, that might be the exercise that you choose to complete as part of this topic. So, some early warning signs of job stress include having low morale, if you're dissatisfied with your job, if you're at work and you're having a hard time concentrating, having a short temper. If this sort of stress or these responses to stress aren't detected and taken care of a little early on, it could impact our work productivity, it could lead to burnout, and it could also lead to physical ailments within our body. It could lead to emotional difficulties, psychological issues. So, because work, we spend so much time at work. Sometimes it could be 8 hours. Some people are at work for 12 hours a day, and it is such a big part of our lives. We want to make sure that we feel some level of satisfaction and happiness, similar to when we're outside of work with our families or with our home life. We want that life to feel pretty good too. So it's important to have balance in all areas of our life. So, burnout is a state of physical and mental exhaustion that's caused by excessive and prolonged stress. There's a difference between stress versus burnout. So, stress involves, for example, having too much of something. So, there are too many pressures, too many demands. However, most of the time, you can imagine that if they could get the situation under control, you could get some relief from the stress. And that relief is probably around the corner. You're typically aware of when you're under stress, and you might be able to put some strategies in place to cope with that. Maybe you develop a checklist or you reorganize yourself. Now, burnout means that there's just not enough. Someone who's burned out, they lack the motivation. At this point, they may not care. It's difficult to see that there is hope for any positive changes. And when you're burnt out, you may not be fully aware that this is happening. Working in the school system, I see this sometimes where there are teachers and other staff who are burned out. And I'm not sure if they recognize it, but oh boy, can an outsider looking in recognize it. And you can see the impact that this has on the children that they work with and the very important job they have of molding young minds. Causes of burnout at work can include being underpaid, feeling underappreciated, being criticized for things that just are outside of your control, if there are some unrealistic goals being set, if you're just expected to do too many things. Um, these are some things that can lead to burnout. Now, if these things are happening for you at your job, there are ways to begin to be proactive to address some of them by having some positive, proactive conversations with maybe human resources or your supervisor to see if any of these issues could be addressed. Sometimes, through those proactive conversations, maybe not all of these situations could be addressed, but maybe more realistic goals could be set. Or maybe you might be able to negotiate an additional couple of days off per year. So sometimes having those conversations can be helpful. So if you're feeling stressed at work, some of the effects of that is it could reduce how productive you are. You might have less energy, you might feel unhappy. It can also spill over into your home and it could affect your family. Um, Recognizing those early warning signs of burnout, such as those feelings of feeling trapped or hopeless and sadness, as I mentioned before, are very important.